right? So today's topic is going to be a plastic ocean. And so we're going to be talking about microplastics. So this might be well, maybe it's not. Um, I feel like your generation has a better grasp on environmental issues than my generation and certainly my parents' generation, or even what is it, Gen X, so the generation slightly before me. Um, and so, like in every year I teach about microplastics, people seem to know more and more about it. So I think you guys will have a pretty good handle on this idea of plastics being a negative thing. And so all the things we're going to talk about will just be an expansion on that probably idea of plastics being a negative, because there really is a sharp generational divide, right? So like when I go see my mom, she lives in the same town as I do, and I'll bring her something, and she'll be like, why didn't you bring me bottled water? Why didn't you bring me bottled this? Why didn't you bring me plastic this? And I'm like, well, that's not good, right? That's not good for you. That's not good for the environment. So plastics as a thing are super duper important, right? There's very little that you can see in your home or your environment that is plastics can do. But if you look at sort of again, like older generations, they see plastics as this amazing thing. It was marketed to them as this one-time use thing. It can be, you can throw it away as you need to. It's amazing. It doesn't harm you at all, right? That's how plastics were marketed back to baby boomers and Gen X certainly. So there is this really cool, interesting generational divide, and there's sort of this tug of war going on between them, where younger generations are like, no, no, no plastic, and old generations are like, we don't care. That's kind of how they view a lot of environmental issues in general, but certainly for plastics. Now, as I mentioned, this is kind of a sad class, so I'll start off with some happy pictures of my dog Chip. He goes to daycare, and he went bobbing for apples yesterday, and this is what he looks like eating apples, and he is really cute. Um, he did not like to bob for the apples. He liked the apples to be taken out of the bath of the little tub and fed to him, which I think is on point for him because he loves apples and he also likes to be fed. So, anyways, I thought I would start this class because it's going to be a lot of sad pictures, as you already saw from the first one, right? Already a sad picture. So I thought I'd start the class off with some happy pictures of my dog Chip bobbing for apples and just being a handsome little guy that he is. So he's a he's 9 months now. He still pees in the house, so he's wonderful. And he is actually, I don't know if you see my video camera, but you can see him. He's actually sleeping on the couch behind me. So again, starting off with happy things. So so after the happy stuff, we're gonna start with a quote by one of the companies of this planet that you never would think would be kind of a slightly evil company. Um, but Nestle in the recent years has proven itself to be just a really not so friendly company to people that aren't its consumers. So this quote from John Catarano, um, who's an executive at Nestle, says the water bottle has in some ways become the mink coat or the pack of cigarettes. It is socially not very acceptable to young folks, and that scares me. And the reality is, he probably should be scared. Young folks, as I mentioned, you guys are much more environmentally conscious. You know the effects of climate change. You know the effects of plastics. You know the effects of not recycling and throwing your trash in the environment. You know that. And for someone like John Catarano, whose business is so heavily related upon not just harvesting of the natural resources of the planet, water in particular, but basically people to overconsume single-use plastics. So his business model and the model of Coke and Pepsi and all these big, manufacturers of and users of plastics is based upon this idea of one plastic, one use, then you throw it away. And that's not something that's particularly acceptable to younger generations, certainly not acceptable to environmentalists, but it's definitely something that is more acceptable to the older generations. And as you'll see, it becoming stigmatized is actually kind of going to be a good thing. Like it really will be a good thing. There's so much we don't know about the effects of plastics. on physiology and the environment. And what we do know should scare everyone. It really should. So this sort of fear in the business model is a good thing. And I don't know if you guys saw this last year, but where this whole like uproar about plastic straws and turtles was happening. All the big companies were trying to do something about it for some good PR. And then you had a monster company like Coke came along and they're like, no, we're good. Our customers like the plastic bottle too much. And so companies like Nestle, which I think is owned by Coke, if I'm not mistaken. You have to correct me. I feel like Pepsi. I feel like Coke or Pepsi owns Nestle. I can't remember. But big companies like this are choosing, in spite of what younger generations think, to not sort of divest from a plastic world. And that's again because they have a huge base of older folks that are more than happy to drink a single plastic water bottle and then throw it away and then go get another one, as opposed to someone like me, and I'm sure like many of you here will use a reusable plastic bottle or use a plastic bottle that's multiple times. Now we're going to talk about the effects of microplastics. We're going to talk about the effects of larger plastics that are directly on marine life. So from what we know now, there's about 700 marine species that are negatively affected by plastics, by ocean plastics. Now, there's terrible images like a sea turtle with a plastic straw stuck up its nose, a plastic wrapped around a salmon, and a seal trapped in discarded fishing gear. Right? These are horrible pictures to look at. And I'm going to go to the next slide. Oh shoot, I forgot. There's only terrible things on the next slide. I'm going to go back to the slide so I don't have to look at that. Uh, but they're gruesome, right? And so the lens we're going to view plastics through for this class is the ocean. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that microplastics only affect the ocean, because they don't. Microplastics, as we'll talk about, affect human biology and physiology, and microplastics also affect aquatic systems, so like lakes and rivers and streams, and they also affect soils. So there's nothing that microplastics don't affect, but the best research that we know is via the ocean. And you can look at, again, some really terrible things, and you can look at even more terrible things, right? A seal being trapped on its face by a plastic bag, or a whale that's, it's been killed because its stomach contents were filled with flip-flops and drinking cups and plastic bags and 4 plastic bottles, right? So really sort of unfortunate things. And you can just look at pictures even on the Massachusetts coastline, right? You can pull huge pieces of plastic and fishing gear and plastic bags just on our coastal area. So it is a problem for marine life. And as we'll see, it's not just a problem for marine life. It's at, the big things that are, exciting to see, but there's a problem for everything at all levels of the marine food web. So let's talk about some plastic numbers. And it's an astounding amount of numbers. And you guys are more interested in finances and business, so I'm sure you guys like numbers, and I also love numbers. And so these numbers are kind of astounding every time I go back and update these numbers every year, and I see how they only increase over time, and it's a really huge number. But we have about 275 to 300 million tons of plastics are just created annually. Now, of those plastics, about 50%, or about 150 million tons, is single use. Now, what do we mean by single use here? Single use is I use it once and it goes into the garbage. So I have a plastic bottle that has Coke in it. I drink that Coke. I go, I'm going to throw that Coke in the trash. That's single use. Or I go to the grocery store. I get my groceries bagged in plastic bags. I take those groceries home. I take my groceries out of it, and then I throw those groceries away. I'm sorry, I throw the plastic bag away in the trash. That's single use. Or the much more like uh, well-known one in terms of recent environmental activists is like plastic straws, right? I go to a restaurant, I drink my soda or my whatever with a plastic straw, and then the restaurant throws away that plastic straw. Right? So that's what we're talking about. Single use is 50%, 50%. Now, other types of plastic are going to be more long-term use, right? Like part of your monitors and your computers, um, building materials, anything you can really think of, there's probably plastics in it. And even things you don't think of, clothing, paper, things that you don't quite think of that have plastic in it, have plastic in it. So plastic is used a lot more than you might think. Now, of that 50% that is single use, and of that total amount, about 20 million tons of that enters the oceans annually. So that's a lot. 20 million tons, which is a lot. So, of the plastic that makes it into the ocean, 80% of it comes from land-based sources, which is saying that it came through a river or it went directly from the land into the ocean. But mostly what we're talking about here is things making it into our rivers, and all rivers eventually flow into the ocean. So that's the flow we're thinking about here. Humans are being irresponsible with your garbage. We're being, we're throwing it away on purpose. It accidentally gets out and eventually gets to the rivers and gets to the ocean. So everything at the end of the day, the oceans are this like great dumping ground of the planet. Everything eventually will make it there. But it just sort of depends on how long and how big it's going to be before it makes it there. In terms of of that material, it's about 1.15 to 2.4 million tons of plastic enters the oceans, rivers via rivers annually, and of that, the peak occurs between May and October. So when people are out and about. So during the summer and early fall, when people are very active, a lot of plastic makes it into the ocean. So and then in terms of which rivers are making the biggest impact, most of them are in Asia. So of the top 20 rivers, they contribute 67% of all plastics to the ocean, with the top contributor for rivers being the Yangtze River in China. So we have this little handy table. We have the river name, the country of origin, and then the average yearly discharge in terms of water, and then how much mass is being physically put in. You have a lower, middle, and upper. So just estimates of how much we're putting out there. And you'll notice that we have quite a bit of plastics coming in via these rivers every year in terms of the top 20 ones. And as you'll see, it's a pretty heavily concentrated in Asia, so mostly Southeast Asia. But there's certainly no shortage of plastics coming down the Amazon River, as well as some rivers in Africa. But again, it is pretty heavily concentrated in Asia in terms of plastic river waste. My guess would be it might just be like a cultural thing. I'm not really sure. It says it's so concentrated in Asia. It makes me think maybe there's not a huge stigma on throwing your trash out. I'm not really sure, but that would be my guess on the matter. But again, I have no idea. Now, in terms of what this looks like, if we graph this, you can see this mismanaged plastic waste in metric tons per year. And you can see China does lead the way. And this is the one graph where we're actually not number one in something really bad, which is good. We're number 20. We're the top 20. We're in the top 20, but we're not in the top 10, or certainly not the most polluting country in terms of plastic. So I think that's pretty good. It's one time we didn't make a huge thing. And I think it's also interesting because we have 350 million people. A country like Morocco has 25 to 30 million people, so we're doing pretty good on a per capita basis as well. But again, still not great, as you will see. So as I mentioned, most of the plastic makes it into the ocean via rivers. There are many other sources of microplastics to our beloved ocean, and these include agricultural runoff. And so what does agricultural runoff mean? Well, when we spray our crops with fertilizers, plastics get in there, both intentionally and unintentionally. And that runoff makes it to rivers and eventually makes it to the ocean. Next up is aquaculture, which is obviously the growing of marine or freshwater animals for consumption, and plastics make it in there as well, as we feed them in their tanks, so on and so forth. And as you'll get the feeling here, everything flows to the ocean. Cruise ships love dumping stuff overboard. They really do. Not just the passengers, but the cruise companies. They love dumping trash into the ocean because it means they don't have to take care of it after the fact. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. Ocean dumping in general. So like any companies or private citizens just dumping their trash in the oceans, either on purpose or accidentally. Storm water runoff is also a relatively important one, because you can imagine if you have a pretty heavy storm, it picks up a lot of plastics and things like that and dumps it into the rivers and eventually dumps it into the ocean. Shipping and fishing industries is a big one too. So they have their nets and they leave their nets out there. And those nets just hang around, as you'll see. Runoff from urban environments and poor waste management. So both of these things come from urban environments and the overall poor management of waste. And I just wanted to highlight this slap on the wrist from Carnival. That was so in 2018, Carnival received a $20 million fine, which if you do it's if you calculate if it's revenues for that year, it was only 0.1% of the $18 billion fine that it got. I'm sorry, of its profits of that $20 million fine. So it's basically like a slap on the wrist. It'd be like the equivalent of fining you $100. Like that's not going to deter you at all, right? But they got fined 20 million bucks for dumping plastic and food waste into the ocean. And this is not the first time Carnival has done this, and it certainly won't be the last time. But the reality is, it's probably cheaper for them to continuously dump all their plastic and all their waste into the ocean than it is for them to take care of the waste. Because if they only get a $20 million fine, I'm sure to get rid of their waste every year, it's way more than $20 million. So I'm sure this is probably a great thing for Carnival. It's pristine, but they don't really seem to care. So I digress. So, as we discussed, the single biggest use contributors to plastics in making it into the environment is our single use plastics. And I've mentioned a couple of them, like plastic bottles and plastic bags, but there's also sometimes things you don't quite think of, right? Um, there's this recent study that showed that denim, most denim products, unless it's like really high end denim, like like crazy, like $300 a pair of jeans from Italy type of jeans, releases plastic into the water every time it's washed. So microplastics, plastics as a product make it in a variety of ways. So the top contributor is actually just cigarette butts. Cigarettes contain plastics in them. They help them. Their filters are partially plastic, and so people don't take care of their cigarette butts, right? They just throw them on the ground. And as we talked about, things get washed into rivers and they eventually get washed into the ocean. So that's the biggest contributor. There are a lot of smokers on this planet. Even for all the bad press that smoking gets, there's still a lot of smokers. So it still is the largest source of microplastics. But our plastic lids and our plastic bottles, and then also plastic bags and plastic food wrappers and straws and stuff like that. So this is how it breaks down. Now, the reality of plastics is, and I'm sure you guys probably know this, is that they don't go away, right? If I take a piece of plastic and I throw it in the ocean, it's never going to go away. And I mean that. It's never actually going to go away. So when we look at this, we have marine debris and how long does this take to break down? Now, this is how long it takes to break down. And what do I mean by break down? I mean it goes from a plastic water bottle into microscopic pieces of plastic. That's what we're talking about. Going from a bottle to microscopic plastics. But that microscopic plastic never goes away. It's always there. And so when we say microplastics or plastics break down, it's not that they're going away, right? It's not like I take an apple and I put it in my backyard and I come back in 6 weeks and the apple's gone, right? Because things have eaten it, the microbes have broken it down, animals have eaten it, right? What I mean by plastics breaking down is they break down into smaller components, but those components are always there. They never go away. Remember, plastics are synthetic, which means that there's no thing on this planet that likes to eat it naturally. So it's not an ideal piece of material for life. Now, we can look at the breakdown time of these things. So your average plastic bottle is 450 years, fishing lines are 600 years, disposable papers, 450 years, glass bottles basically never break down. Cigarette butts take 1 to 5 years, plastic bags 10 to 20 years, uh, six, a photodegradable six-pack plastic ring takes 35 days. But again, these aren't breaking down in the sense of going away. They're just breaking down into smaller components. So it just depends how long it takes them to do that. It's a really important thing to note. When people say, oh, the plastics goes away, it doesn't go away. It just changes from a big form into a small form. Which leads us to this idea of microplastics. Now, microplastics are defined as any piece of plastic that is less than 5 millimeters in size, so less than a half a centimeter. So visible with your eye, but still very, very, very small. So plastics don't, remember, they don't decompose, right? They're not, they're not eaten by something and they respire it, right? They're not eating it in the sense of like you eat a Chipotle burrito, right? They're it's breaking down into smaller microscopic components. Now, plastic breaks down for a couple reasons. The most common is via what we call photodegradation, which is the sun, the ultraviolet rays for the sun and all the other rays that are coming in from the sun hit the plastic, and it causes the plastic to fracture, become brittle, and eventually break apart. So that's photodegradation is by far the most common. But we also see a pretty heavy amount of breakage due to wind and wave action in the ocean itself. We also see it not uncommonly in soils where like things will bite the plastic and then spit it out. Um, and so there are like animal action on plastics as well. But the most common again is this idea of photodegradation. And we can sort of see what this looks like. So we have a rainbow runner. It's just a species of fish. It has 18 pieces of plastic that it's digested. Now, these aren't microplastics, but they are visual plastics. Now, we can see an actual piece of microplastics in this copepod, which is a microscopic marine organism. Um, and you can see the microplastics staining green here. So you can physically see the microplastics. And they start bigger, right? They start as plastic bottles, and as the sun and the wind and the waves breaks them down, they become smaller bits like this, and over time and over more time they break down into things that even the smallest organisms such as copepods, again, which are microscopic, can can ingest. Now, can they digest them? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, so microplastics, again, they come from breaking down of plastic that's made into the ocean, but a big source of microplastics is what we call virgin plastic, or plastic that has never been processed into something bigger. And this is typically comes in the form of what we call microbeads. And these are manufactured microscopic pieces of polyethylene plastic that are used to be added into as like beauty products and exfoliants and things like that, as well as toothpastes. So you find microbeads in your toothpaste. So every time you brush your teeth, you spit that stuff out into the sink, you are actually dumping plastics into the ocean as well. But again, there's these microplastics as well, microbeads. Barack Obama in 2015 did sign an Anti-Microbead Act. It hasn't really gone anywhere. Hasn't really had a meaningful impact. But he did sign something, which is better than nothing. Um, and then finally, one of the most common ones, and this is plastic comes in places you don't quite think where it is, but microfibers, where you see them in clothing or textiles that are made up of nylon, polyester, or polypropylene. Even something that isn't made of these, like denim. Denim really commonly has microfibers, which are just little strands of microplastics. So lots of sources of plastic, either micro ones, inadvertent ones, or breakdown of larger pieces of plastic. So there's multiple ways microplastics make it into this marine system. Now, you might say, okay, plastics are making it to the ocean. Where the heck are they going? And the reality is plastics are everywhere. Now, when I was your age, I really liked the survival shows like Man versus Wild and Survivor Man. Bear Grylls, the guy that drinks his pee and eats gross stuff. I really like those shows. But one of the sad things about those shows is, sometimes they would drop them off at these like desert islands, right? And to survive, right? And they would go there and they would search around the islands to find stuff, and they would find plastic. So they would be dropped off at these islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they would find plastics in the middle of the ocean where no one was living. And the sad reality is trash, but in particular plastics, is everywhere. No matter where you go on this planet, there is trash, there is plastics. And again, this is a combination of inadvertent and on purpose dumping of plastics and waste into the environment. And we'll talk about waste again in this class, but just remember, you'll learn as we handle waste really poorly in general. like really poorly. But in terms of the ocean, plastics are distributed everywhere from the top of the ocean all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, but it is heavily concentrated in coastal environments. So it is really heavily found in coastal environments. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, if you remember back from our population demography class, most of the human population is concentrated near the oceans. So most of the plastic that we waste and gets out to the environment is close to where we are, which is at the coast of the ocean. So there's lots of scenes like this um, where plastic is just polluting heavily the coastal ocean. And that's the coastal ocean. So, and it also includes what we call the pelagic zone, which is the upper layers of the ocean. So the first 500 meters or so, so top of the ocean. But it also makes down into what we call the benthic regions or the benthos. And you might ask yourselves, how does it get down to the bottom of the ocean? Well, it gets there via ocean currents and the mixing of wind as well. So it makes it everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I actually do mean everywhere. So there's a recent study that came out last year. You can read about it here in the BBC, where they found they found not just microplastics, but they found plastics, as you can see here and here, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And I'm sure most of you have probably heard of the Mariana Trench before. It's kind of a fun thing to discuss because it is the deepest point of our planet. It is it's a trench that is 11 kilometers deep. So it's super, super deep, miles and miles deep, for those of you that don't like kilometers. And we find plastics there, which is really sad, right? A place that we've barely explored, we've barely been to, but our waste products are already there. And that's I'm smiling because it's more of like a disgusted thing as opposed to a amused thing, which is kind of crazy. So that's our microplastics. That's how we get plastics into the ocean, right? Irresponsible usages of not only single-use plastics, but long-term use plastics, and irresponsible handling of our wastes. Now, plastics are distributed everywhere, as we discussed, but why do we care about them, right? I showed you terrible pictures, right, of a seal with a plastic bag on its face and a fish with a piece of plastic around its throat, right? Well, it's fish throat. Fish don't really have throats. But why do we care about them, right? Are they just affecting big things? Are they affecting small things? Are they affecting humans? What the heck are they affecting? And the reality is there is a lot of research that needs to be done on this topic. I don't want to lead you to think that we know everything about this topic in terms of the direct effects of plastics on marine environments as well as humans. We still need to learn a lot. Microplastics as a field is relatively new because for years and years and years, it was impossible to get funding for it through the federal government as well as through private places um, because people just didn't see it as a problem. And there's also a lot of lobbying on the part of the oil industry, but that's neither here nor there. So it is a relatively new field. So I don't want you to think like this is all we know or we know everything. We actually don't. There's a lot to be learned from studying plastics still. But what we do know and what we'll see here should worry you. And it should worry everyone because it's not just effects on marine life, it's effects on everything. But again, even if we're just thinking about the effects on marine life, as we know from this course, affecting marine life, right, affecting biodiversity can affect an ecosystem and the services that it provides to humans. So let's talk about some of these effects. So POPs or POPs, persistent organic compounds, can actually physically stick to plastics. Now, not in addition to these POPs or persistent organic compounds. So just as a note, persistent just means obviously it hangs around. Organic means it's like a carbon-based compound. So it's something that can directly harm life. And then a compound is just a compound. So that's what a persistent organic compound is. The most common one is like BPA. I'm sure you guys have seen BPA-free water bottles. That's a persistent organic compound. Now, in addition to PCBs, heavy metals, mercury, cadmium, lead, things that are really toxic, like to also stick to plastics as well. Now, they love to stick to plastics. You just do. It's like a chemistry thing that's you guys don't care about, but they just like to stick to plastics because of their properties. Now, many of these things that stick to plastics stay pretty heavily publicized when the research about it came out, and it is mostly like banned from most plastic companies as a general note. But it does what we call a hormone mimicker. So it mimics estrogen. So for those of you that aren't super familiar with hormones, hormones are basically like long distance signaling molecules in your body. So if your brain wants your foot to do something, it can send an electrical pulse. But if it wants something that's sustained, it sends a hormone. And so hormones basically tell your body over long distances how to communicate, how to work together. And so you can imagine ingesting something that mimics a hormone. That's not a good thing. And I'm sure you guys all know estrogen is, heavily upregulated in women relative to men, but it is still is expressed in men. Is involved with all sorts of processes, right? And so having too much estrogen is not a good thing. And compounds like BPA can actually mimic estrogen. And BPA itself also is cancer causing. So we've known it is associated with multiple types of cancer. And so these things stick directly to plastics. But the reality of something like BPA and things that are like BPA is they're actually synthetic, meaning that they come from the process of making plastics. So these aren't like natural things like lead or cadmium that they plastics will pick up in the environment. These are things that are flame retardants are toxic, right? Um, Pesticides and flame retardants, like you think of like asbestos, um, they're toxic. So if they bind to plastics and they get ingested, that's an ingestion of something toxic. But also things like caffeine, right? Caffeine we think of as a good thing, but caffeine is really, really toxic, right? We take caffeine, like I'm drinking coffee right now. It's got caffeine. But caffeine was invented as a, not invented, but evolved as a compound to kill things. We use it to help us be happy and productive, but and as it's like a performance enhancer, but caffeine was developed to kill things. So caffeine is toxic, as is acetaminophen, and high doses of estrogen are also bad as well. So lots of persistent organic things stick on to things. And that's like the sort of indirect things, right? These ones increase in their toxicity as you eat more and more of it, right? So a little bit of caffeine is not bad, but if I eat a bunch of plastics that have a bunch of caffeine on them, then it starts to build up and it starts to be bad for me. Now, there is the direct effects. So you eat consumption, right? You eat them and your stomach gets filled with plastics. That's a direct effect of eating plastics. But the reality is, as marine organisms eat more of this stuff, it starts to build up in the food chains. It starts to build up in the food webs. And what we do know is that as fish and mussels and things like that start to eat these things, it starts to have some negative effects on the biology. And what do I mean by this? Well, it causes reduced what we call reproductive output, so i.e., making more babies. It causes physical and internal damage, can reduce growth. But the scary thing, what it does, is it actually does this process of biomagnification. And this process of biomagnification, you've heard of something like it before, is my guess. But we're going to talk more specifically about what it means now. I will give you just a hint about this. I love asking this question on quizzes and stuff like that. I love asking people to explain biomagnification to me. So just as an FYI. And you do have a quiz coming up before the end of the semester. So, all right. So bioaccumulation, how does this work? So bioaccumulation is essentially just a different way of saying biomagnification. And basically it is the process by which anything is magnified as you go up the food chain, as I go from small things to bigger things. And so the basic example you see here is we see the accumulation of a toxin, which is just ill-defined here as blue, going from copepods to fish to seals to polar bears. And as you can see, the fullness of blue, which is the contaminant levels, increases as I go up the food chain. That's what biomagnification or bioaccumulation themselves are referring to. So as it gets more and more concentrated as it moves up the food chain. Now, the way this works is we have some sort of toxic compound. In this case, it's PCBs, right? So this is just a form of toxic plastic. Now, the way this works is it gets into the environment, right, as we've discussed. And the things that are at the bottom of the food chain, right, the small things, including the phytoplankton, right, they start to absorb it because that's just what they do. Small things, they just naturally absorb toxins from the environment. But they're so small that they can only absorb a little bit of it, and it doesn't directly harm them, at least not in meaningful amounts. So they start to absorb the stuff. And pretty much everything in this food web here will absorb that PCB, right, that toxic compound. Now, the bottom of that food chain, which in this case is phytoplankton, will be eaten by things that are bigger. And they'll start to pick up the things that the phytoplankton have picked up. And then those small things will be eaten by bigger things. And those will be eaten by bigger things and then bigger things. But the idea is because as we move up the food chain, you can see things get bigger, right? A large whale, a mammal like an orca is big, right? It needs to eat a lot of salmon or whatever it is it's eating. Probably not salmon. It's probably too small for an orca. They eat like penguins and stuff. But they have to eat a lot of what's below them. And same thing for the thing below them and below them. So because things as you move up the food chain need more and more energy, they have to eat more and more stuff that's below them, which means they're being exposed to more and more of those bad things. So what bioaccumulation and biomagnification tells us, as they eat more and more of the stuff below them, they're going to start accumulating more and more and more of those toxins. So that's this process. Again, it's just because of how they do, how they eat, right? Because an orca needs to eat a lot of salmon if it's going to eat salmon. But for there to be a lot of salmon, salmon have to eat a lot of herring, right? And for there to be a lot of herring, they have to eat a lot of zooplankton. For there to be a lot of zooplankton, they have to eat a lot of phytoplankton. So the food chain essentially just increases it as it goes up. Now, if you think about how humans come into play here, what do we eat? Well, we eat big things. So when we eat salmon, we're eating something that's pretty high up in the food chain. So we're getting a pretty high dose of whatever contaminants are found naturally in these environments. So this is how biomagnification makes it to your dinner plate. So I'm sure you guys have probably heard of like mercury contaminated tuna, uh, or like mercury free tuna and stuff like that. Big scare in the 2000s and the 90s. Mercury tuna with mercury in it got to be because of bioaccumulation or biomagnification. So that's how it gets to us. So it gets to our dinner plate by this effect of biomagnification. Now, I don't want you to think this is just something only found in marine stuff. So if you stopped eating fish, you would be exposed to less stuff. That's just not true. This happens with cows. This happens with pigs. This happens with chickens. It happens with all of our livestock. It also gets picked up by our plants as well. So you find microplastics inside corn, soybeans, and so on and so forth. So it's not just marine stuff. It gets picked up by everything. Because remember, only half of our plastic waste makes it into the ocean, which means the rest of the plastic waste is hanging around on land. And you'll see plastics make it into your life in another way in just a moment. Now, the effects on the marine food web and human health, again, it's still a very active field of research. We just don't know right now. What we do know, again, should scare you, and not scare you into like, I'm never going to touch plastic again, but should scare you into thinking about your usage of plastic. It should scare everyone, but you in particular, since you know what I'm talking about, it should get you to think about it. But the effects of human health are what we know thus far is not particularly exciting. It's concerning. So we know that when we absorb these persistent organic compounds, there's lots and lots of health effects. BPA got such a bad rap a couple years ago because there was direct effects of BPA in terms of causing cancer and all sorts of other impacts on our biology. So there are these direct effects, but we know that there are other types of compounds out there they're called phthalandates, which are plasticizers. So these are added to plastics to make them more flexible and durable. These phthalandates are endocrine disruptors, which means they affect normal hormone mechanisms in your body that allow any biological organism to interact with itself as well as the environment. And so what we do know about the direct effects of these on human biology include effects to human growth, metabolism. So if you eat a lot of this or you ingest a lot of this, it's directly related to stunting your growth as well as affecting your metabolism. We know there are impacts to fertility. So we know most of our stuff by actually studying men. So we know there's direct, and I'm sorry guys, I have to pick on us today, but there is direct effects on male fertility, reduced semen quality, damage to our sperm's DNA, decreased sperm motility, and decreased volume of semen. So there's direct effects on male biology, but we also know there are direct effects on female biology as well. There's reduced egg viability and things like that. There's also some evidence suggests that it affects early development. In particular, there might be a linkage between ADHD and autism and the exposure to these microplastics and the things that they carry. And we know there seems to be some relationship between phthaldate exposure and diabetes, insulin resistance, breast cancer, and obesity. So lots of negative effects, but the reality of it is that this just seems to be a small component of it. And the long-term, there's no good long-term studies on these things right now. These are more anecdotal things right now. As I mentioned, these are, there's a lot of evidence that suggests they're bad, but how bad they are and how prevalent they are in the population is still something we don't quite know. So, um, uh, sorry that my dog was barking. uh, so in terms of the direct effects, there's a lot to be learned here. Guys, go. Sorry, dog battle happening right now. Sorry about that. The direct effects were still sort of up in the air. We don't know all of them, but we're certainly going to learn more going forward. Now, what we've talked about thus far is ingesting plastics, but there is another mechanism by which you are exposed to plastics, and this is plastic bottles. So a study from a couple of years ago found that microplastics were found in 93% of bottled water, which is not so fun of a fact. I picked on Nestle earlier. I'm going to pick on them again. They found that Nestle brand had the highest concentrations of microplastics in water, between 6 and 10,000 pieces of microplastics per a single bottle of water. And that was tested in the United States and other countries' flags that I can't really see on this picture. But you can see that no matter which water bottle company you're doing, you're being exposed to microplastics in some shape or form. Some are better than others. Some are worse than others. It depends on the quality of plastic they use and how they store their plastics. Remember, plastics break down into microplastics via photodegradation. So leaving a bottle of water out in the sun, that's a bad idea because it's going to break off all sorts of microplastics. And so microplastics make it in via your water, and not just water bottles. It's any water bottle that holds soda, holds vitamin water, it holds coffee, right? Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, right? It makes it through all those things. And I will also make a note of it is that things that get hot, like coffee and teas, um, they have much more microplastics in them because hot things cause, like hot liquids cause plastics to break down faster. So just as a note. So even if you didn't eat fish or you somehow didn't eat meat and you only ate a vegetarian diet, but you still drank out of plastic water bottles, you'd still get it. Now, these plastic water bottles, as we've mentioned, are single use. So they're not made out of the best plastic. So plastics that are, like designed for long-term use typically do better, but they definitely have microplastics in them, just as a note. So your best bet in terms, if you want like a good piece of drinking, like a bottle for drinking, is to go metal, and to get a good metal one, not like the cheap ones that you can buy for like $5, but like spend like 20 or 30 bucks on a good metal one, so it doesn't have a plastic lining. It's made out of good metal that won't corrode. Just as a note. So now this brings us to sort of our couple, final slides here. So I'm sure you guys all saw, Tom Brady and Starbucks and Disney all banning plastics or shunning them at least. And this got a lot of attention, right? Last year, plastics straws got a huge amount of attention. And that's a good and a bad thing, right? People think plastic straws are a problem, and they certainly are. I showed you a picture of a turtle with one stuck up its nose, and that's clearly a bad thing. But plastics as a whole, remember, they account for only about 3.03% of all total plastic waste by mass. So, they're still a top 10 contributor to plastic waste in the ocean, but as a total amount, it's not a lot of plastic, right? 0.03% is a small. That's not like 3%. That's like 0.03%. So not a lot of plastic. So not a huge impact, right? Even if everyone stopped using plastics, right? If people kept using bottles and smoking, right? That's way more impactful than plastic. Now, the interesting thing about this is it all got started by a 9-year-old girl's term paper that her term paper reported an actual false statistic that said 500 million straws were consumed daily, but that's actually not true. It's much less, um, but still a lot of straws are consumed every day. Every day. Don't get me wrong, but it's not close to 500 million. However, so I kind of bash this. It's not a big deal, but it actually it is a big deal in the sense of plastic straws are actually seen as like a gateway plastic, right? People don't see them as a harmful thing as they do like plastic bottles or plastic bags. So people that use plastic straws are also more likely to use big other types of single-use plastic. And so getting people more aware of using plastics and the dangers of using plastics in terms of straws might be a catalyst to get them thinking about using plastic bottles and plastic bags. So it might be a good gateway plastic to essentially like get people to think about it. And we saw the same thing in the 90s with dolphin safe tuna. There was this big uproar in the 90s, when you guys were either not born or you were very, very little, about tuna that was dolphin safe, because there was this huge expose on almost all news networks about how dolphins were being killed by tuna fishermen in their nets and stuff like that. And so it sparked this huge public outrage, leading to this whole industry of dolphin safe tuna. It still exists today. It's not as advertised as it used to be, but it still exists. And so the dolphins weren't that big a deal, right? It was gruesome how they were dying, but it wasn't a huge amount of dolphins. But it was a small part of a bigger problem of marine life being harmed by fisheries, which sort of catapulted us to thinking more and more about the effects of humans on marine life. So we hope that this plastic straw phenomenon that you see our former friend Tom Brady here. I don't know. I don't think he's our friend anymore in New England, right? Because he plays for Tampa Bay. Um, I don't know. I'm not a big football person, and I never really liked Tom Brady, anyways. So for those of you that are New England fans, I'm sorry. Don't hate me, but I just never really liked Tom Brady as a person. But certainly might not be a huge impact, but maybe it leads to us being more cognizant of our plastic use. Now, since this is Bentley, we're going to talk about some business in plastic. So plastic is clearly a big industry, right? Some of the biggest companies on the planet are petroleum companies, right? BP, ExxonMobil, right? Huge, huge multinational companies. And so they make a lot of money off plastics, and they make a lot of money off single-use plastics. They don't make a lot of money off of long-term use plastics like the plastics that go into your computer, but they make a lot of money off single-use plastics, right? Because people consume a lot of straws, a lot of bottles, a lot of cigarettes, right? They make a lot of stuff. But because plastics have been such a problem, we're seeing actually new industries being essentially born. And they're born in terms of industries to clean up oceanic plastics. So there's a couple of companies that we'll just briefly discuss. So this includes Ocean Cleanup. It's a nonprofit. It's developing technologies to reduce oceanic plastics in the ocean. And so that's kind of cool. It was actually founded by an 18-year-old Danish inventor, Boyan Slat. And he wants to reduce the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is just this monstrous patch of garbage. It's not continuous, but there's a spot in the ocean where all the currents just push everything into the center, which is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's not like it's not like an island or anything like that, but it's just like this monster area that's covered by plastic. And he's trying to reduce that plastic by 2040. And he deployed his little thing here. It's just like a not like a buoy, but it's like a floating object that's designed to pick up plastic. And so he's doing a pretty good job, and he's picking up lots of plastic, and there's lots of other ventures like him that are picking up lots of plastics. However, critics of people like him, and rightfully so, that we shouldn't be really focusing on not just on cleaning up plastic already in the ocean. We need to be cleaning up plastic at the mouth of rivers, right? So he's focusing on cleaning up the ocean patch, But the reality is that we estimate that only 3 to 5% of plastic that's in the ocean ends up in the great ocean patches like that, which are called gyres. They're just spinning parts of the ocean. So he's tackling a problem, but he's tackling only a small fraction of the problem. Now, I don't want you to dissuade you from thinking that ocean cleanup is not a good thing. It is. It really is. But we could be doing better. Better technologies looking at the ocean. And you can see what this looks like. He's picking up plastics. You can see all sorts of stuff, nets, um, pieces of, like, there's a tire here. It looks like it's from like a wheelbarrow or something, right? Plastic containers, right? So it's lots of stuff. And so he's being successful. But the important thing to point out here is he's picking up big things. He's not picking up microplastics. He's picking up big things. So the microplastics are still out there. And there's this really nice YouTube video I would recommend you watching, um, how you use ocean cleanup to tackle rivers. If you have, I think it's 12 minutes, I think, please take a peek at this video and watch it. There's also another company called 4Ocean that makes plastic bracelets out of recycled plastic trash and fishing netting. And so this company was founded by a gentleman named Andrew Cooper. And he says, as a for-profit business, we're able to give ocean trash a monetary value and incentivize people all over the world to change their behavior. That's how we clean up the ocean and drive actions and policies that will prevent trash from entering it in the first place. Now, plastics entering the ocean, definitely a tragedy of the common situation, right? We're putting stuff into the ocean because we don't care about what happens to the ocean, right? But there are direct impacts, right? It's affecting marine life, and that affects biodiversity, which affects ecosystem processes, which affects the economy. But there's the potential to turn that trash into ventures, right? Cleaning it up and making products from it, so that we can actually monetize picking up the ocean. Because as we all know, that problems generally don't get solved in a capitalistic world unless there's a monetary incentive. There's not a lot of people that are willing to dump billions of dollars or millions of dollars into cleaning up the ocean just because. So if there is a financial incentive like we see here with 4Ocean, maybe we can do a better job of cleaning up the ocean. Or maybe we just need more people like Bill Gates who are just willing to dump millions of dollars into problems. And so this brings us to Bentley. Now, I've taught at a lot of schools in the Boston area, and I'll give Bentley one thing. Well, I'll give Bentley a lot of things, but one thing I will definitely give them is they're really good at recycling. You guys have a fantastic, oh, I should say we have a fantastic recycling program at Bentley. You really do. Now, Bentley pretty much will recycle anything. Their contract with their waste management company will pretty much recycle everything, but they won't recycle number 6 plastics, which means no cold beverage cups and no red Solo cups. So for those of you that are, using guys aren't going to like this fact. Uh, okay, sorry about that. It's Zoom. Um, the part, so I'll just take a step back. So this are all the things we can recycle, plastics and glass and stuff like that. Now, the reality of recycling at Bentley is it needs to be clean. So when you get a Starbucks cup at Bentley, or you get something from Einstein's Bagels and it's recyclable, just give it a clean before you throw it in the plastic. Because the reality of it is, if you throw away dirty plastic, the probability of it being cleaned by the recycling company and actually recycled is very, very low. It really is. So if you throw away a dirty Starbucks cup and it gets the rest of the bag clean, the clean bag dirty, they might just throw away that bag because it's easier for them to throw that recyclables away than to clean it and to recycle it. So always throw away your stuff clean. And that's not just at Bentley. Try to do that at your house as well if you're recycling at your house. Clean plastic will be recycled. And I'll also just mention one other thing is normally we do a waste audit at Bentley for this class. You're doing a waste audit at your house later in the semester, but usually we do a waste audit at Bentley where I collect trash for you guys, our recyclables, and you sort through them, and you calculate how much trash how much trash Bentley uses and how much we recycle and stuff like that. People hate it because it's gross. So you don't have to do that this semester. So I'm sure that's great, but it is a really impactful thing. But I do want you to know Bentley does a great job recycling. And if you recycle at Bentley, keep doing it. But make sure what you throw away in your recycling bins at Bentley is clean. Now, outside of you just recycling, what can you physically do to mitigate this class plastic problem? Well, the reality is you should cut down single-use things. That's the biggest thing, right? Cutting down single-use things, plastic bags, water bottles. If you smoke, try to smoke less, right? Things like that. That's the reality of it. Cutting down single-use plastic is the best way to help you individually tackle a huge problem. Now, can you as an individual fix this problem? Absolutely not. But you're part of a larger group of people and your dollar matters, right? If you're not going to buy single-use plastic, you're not going to use single-use plastic, people will find other ways to try to sell you things. Right? That's just how capitalism is. So limiting your single-use plastic, cleaning your recyclables as you before you throw them away so they actually get recycled and not just thrown in the landfill is the best thing you can do as an individual. But also, since you learned all this stuff from me, it's good to tell people, to tell your parents, tell your friends, tell your relatives about the problem with plastics. It is a problem, right? I mean, we don't talk about it because it's all you know great, right, and happy. We talk about this because it's a problem. So you being more cognizant and trying to get other people to be more cognizant about their plastic waste is really the best thing you can do. In addition, like if there's ever like a voting issue that comes up about plastic, is to contact your congressman if you care, or your senator if you care about trying to help this at the national level. But the reality is, it's just going to come through people changing their habits. If we don't change our habits, this problem's never going to go away. It's just going to keep you there. And as just so two final things before we go. There's this really interesting new research that's come out in early 19 about a bacteria that wasn't invented, but it was engineered to break down plastic. So they knew this bacteria that was out there. They bioengineered it to make it easier to grow in the lab. And so they have this bacteria that actually can break down plastics. And so what they do is they form what's called a biofilm. So all a biofilm is just a bunch of bacteria growing on top of one another. So if you've ever like forgot to brush your teeth and woke up in the morning and your mouth was covered in a gross slime, that's a biofilm. If you've ever like gone into like a lake or a stream and you slipped on a rock because it was really slippery, that's a biofilm as well. So what ends up happening is these bacteria form a biofilm. They produce these enzymes and they break down the plastics into smaller pieces that they then eat, like they consume it, i.e., like eat it as food, and they also produce carbon dioxide. So, really, really cool bacterial system to potentially mitigate the effects. You can read about it here at the Tara Ocean Expedition site. Really fun microbiology and oceanic site. They're a big research group. They do lots of cool stuff. So if you have a few minutes, it's a great read here to learn about some of the stuff that they do. But this problem is years away, right? We're not there, right? This would be a great problem if we could just seed the entire ocean with these bacteria, right? And they could just break down all the microplastics, not just the big plastics, but the microplastics that we can't physically filter out of the ocean water. But the reality is this solution's years off. So this is something that's cool and potentially beneficial, but we're not quite there yet. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is some hot off the press research. And so these are really brand new stuff, came out this year, and I want to share them. Now, they're linked here for you to read. So there was this recent study with 6,000 participants. They presented this research at the Society for Chemistry meeting, and they found that a study of 6,000 people, they sampled a bunch of different tissues across these people's bodies. And they found that all 6,000 participants across all body sites had microplastics inside their bodies. That's a lot of microplastics, and that's a lot of tissues. So I suggest if that interests you, I suggest you read up on this. It's a really striking sort of presentation that they made. And I'm sure it's going to get published in some great journal later this year. They also found, and I heard this one on NPR actually like 2 days ago, and this is linked to NPR to read it, is that babies around the world are likely consuming about 1.5 million pieces of microplastics daily via bottle feeding. Daily, not like yearly, daily. So most babies are fed with plastic bottles, and those plastic bottles have microplastics in them because people heat them up, right, to disinfect them in the microwave. They also heat up the baby's formula or breast milk to make it more akin to body temperature. Remember, heating things up like that causes the plastics to break down, which cause microplastics to come into the bottle, which then go into the baby. Now, what this study looked at was published in a relatively good journal. They found that they looked at one single type of bottle, one single type of baby bottle, But that one single baby bottle type actually accounted for 82% of the market share of baby bottle sales across the globe. So just this one type of bottle was giving babies 1.5 million pieces of microplastics daily, which is a lot of plastics. Now you can imagine 1.5 million pieces. Babies are bottle fed for what? I don't know, what, 6 months, 10 months? I don't know. I'm not a baby person. For longer than a day, right? So that's a lot of microplastics over the life of being bottle fed. So that's this brand new research on microplastics. Not a lot of fun stuff to talk about. I think the fun stuff we talked about was the pictures of my dogs and the cleanup efforts, but lots of not so fun stuff. Now, last class I had you research a endangered species list. I really enjoyed reading the things that you did, so I'm going to have you do it again. So what I want you to do is hop on over to Blackboard at some point. Doesn't have to be today, doesn't have to be tomorrow, just at some point, and give me a short summary of one piece of media linked in this article. So it could be this article, the video, something about the Four Ocean expedition, any of the things we've talked about that are linked to a piece of media, like a video, or it's linked to a news article or something like that. And give me a quick summary of it and give me your thoughts. I want to hear what you guys think. I thought your little pieces on your endangered species were fantastic. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Just again, it doesn't have to be crazy long, just something very simple. I just like to hear what you have to say. Because again, this is something that directly impacts you, whether or not you realize it or not. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Normally, I would have a discussion in class about it, but Zoom discussions suck. So we're just going to have you use the discussion board. And if you want to be extra ambitious, read your classmates' response and respond to them. But definitely give me some thoughts on what you think about some piece of media I've presented to you in this talk. I'd love to hear about it. You guys have a very different perspective on the world than I do, and I really enjoy hearing and seeing what you guys think about the biology that we talk about. So that is going to bring us to the end of today's class. I hope you guys learned a little something. I hope I didn't scare you too much. So I'm going to stop recording now.